I'm going to land it, in a safe kind of manner. I think I'm going to try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, then I'll just go nose down and call it a night.
Well, Rich, before you do that, let's think about this. I got another pilot coming up, Pilot Joel, here in just a minute or two, I hope, and we'll be able to give you some advice on what to do next.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 75 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and relevant information that pilots like you can hopefully put to use someday. Today, we're going to talk about that Horizon airplane that was stolen from Seattle by an airline employee, and we'll be talking about mental health issues and highlight two stories where the death of a family member or friend resulted in pilots having, in one case, a fatal accident, and in the other case, a pilot deviation. And we'll also be sharing listener feedback and answering listener questions. Plus, coming up in the news, electric airplanes were hot this year at AirVenture, and I'll tell you about a couple that I saw, including one that may be for sale next year. And Boeing is out with their forecast on the need for more pilots in the future, and we'll tell you about an interesting move that they're making, which could partially solve the pilot shortage. And a pilot is challenging the age 65 retirement rule for airline pilots, and we'll tell you in which country he's located. Also, some pilots in another country must now notify passengers that they'll be flying under a lower medical standard than that required for a private pilot. And finally, yes, yet again, another pilot headed to jail, and we'll tell you why. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Prescott. I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or student pilot and hopefully have some fun in the process. And along the way, I'll be sharing my over 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, and as the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And these days, of course, I'm a specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20 and SR22. Now, if you're new to our show, we typically do a weekly news-oriented show. But for the last few weeks, I've been running interviews from AirVenture. In episode 71, we talked with airshow pilot Vicky Benzing. Episode 72 was with aviation advocate Jolie Lucas, who also founded Mooney Ambassadors. And the most listened to episode was with Scott Denstedt, talking about many things you may not know about weather in the cockpit, and that was episode 73. And finally, episode 74 was with Red Bull helicopter and airshow aerobatics pilot Aaron Fitzgerald. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. All this and more, and the news starts now. As you may know by now, a Horizon Air Bombardier-8 Q400 aircraft was stolen from the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in Washington here in the U.S. on August the 10th. The perpetrator, a suicidal airline ground service operator, performed an unauthorized takeoff, and F-15 fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the aircraft. Now, SeaTac Air Traffic Control made contact with the perpetrator, who was the sole occupant, but ultimately he was killed when he crashed the aircraft on Keytron Island. Law enforcement officials identified the pilot as 29-year-old Richard Russell, a Horizon Air ground service operator from Sumner, Washington. He had been part of a tow team which repositions aircraft on the airport apron for about 4 years. A supervisor for Horizon Air described him as a quiet guy who was well-liked by the other workers. The Pierce County Sheriff's Office described him as suicidal and said his actions did not constitute a terrorist threat. Now, Robert Goyer, editor-in-chief at Plane and Pilot magazine, summed it up quite well on Twitter when he said, in dealing with the stolen Q400 last night in Seattle, ATC and DOD did everything right. They dealt with a distraught plane thief, not technically a hijacking in my book, with compassion and with care for lives on the ground. It's all horribly sad, nothing funny about it. Now, Robert is right. It was horribly sad. And as I sorted through and listened to all of the ATC recordings, I too felt sad. So fair warning, I'll be playing some of those ATC recordings later in the show as we talk about our main topic, which is mental health and stress and how it affects pilots. From avweb.com, CAFE Symposium explores flight's future. Now, CAFE, if you don't know, is a foundation which is known as the Comparative Aircraft Flight Efficiency Foundation. And for years, they have held an annual electric aviation symposium here in California. In recent years, it's moved to AirVenture. And they say that after 10 years of annual gatherings, the symposiums are, quote, starting to get realistic about technology, business strategies, and certification, according to Executive Director Yolanda Wolf. She said there are more than 100 eVTOL projects now in development, and, quote, there's a call for companies to work together and maybe each focus on certain components, an airframe or charging system, instead of an entire vehicle. She said the challenges now are not only to continue to develop the technology, but to also face the barriers in place regarding infrastructure, investment, and certification. Quote, I think we all recognize we're not going to have 100 different companies successfully rolling out eVTOLs, she said. Investment dollars are one way that companies are going to be down-selected. However, fixed-wing electric flight is consistently making strides, Wolf said, citing aircraft by Pipistrel, Aviation, and by Aerospace. With a Part 23 rewrite, there is a clear path to certification for those aircraft, according to Wolf. Also, it says for eVTOLs, the pathway still has a long ways to go. Quote, I think we're going to start to see applications, but for urban air taxis, it's going to take a long time for public acceptance and the regulatory structure to catch up. CAFE also is working to ensure that all electric aircraft will be able to use one universal type of charger to make it more practical for pilots to travel. About 60 participants from 5 continents attended this year's symposium. The move to Oshkosh the weekend before AirVenture has proved popular, according to Wolf, and this year CAFE lowered the registration fee for the 2-day event to $175. Also, CAFE partnered with the Vertical Flight Society to record video of all the speakers. Those videos will be available free at the CAFE website in about 8 weeks. And the CAFE website has a really interesting URL. It's cafe.foundation. And just an interesting side note, they mentioned over 100 companies working on VTOLs. I've actually flown with 2 different test pilots from 2 different VTOL companies who wanted to get some flight time in the Cirrus. So there's just a lot of activity going around. It's been fun meeting some of these flight directors. Also from AvWeb, Blackfly multi-rotor makes AirVenture debut. Now, the Silicon Valley startup VTOL Blackfly is showing particular promise and recently demonstrated flying prototypes under the ultralight category. It arrived at aviation's mecca, AirVenture. And I was not aware of this company until Vicky Benzing mentioned it during one of our interviews, and then I went over to take a look. It's being marketed by a company called Opener Inc. The carbon fiber Blackfly is equipped with 8 electric motors. Each motor, they say, weighs 4 pounds and generates 130 pounds of thrust. Opener reps say the company has been testing motor rotor sets for more than 3.5 years, covering a distance equivalent to 20 circumnavigations of the globe. Now, that's a lot of flying. There are 2 batteries per each engine rotor pod, and they're constantly being monitored. Quote, the control system in each wing are triple redundant, leaving room for system failures, said Alan Eustace, director and salesperson for Opener Inc. By the way, I know Alan, as he's based here out of the Palo Alto airport. It says he served as senior vice president of knowledge at Google and has held the world's record for highest altitude freefall jump since October 24th, 2014. You may recall that he's the man who was lifted into the stratosphere via a balloon to beat some of the records from the Red Bull team. The Blackfly, they say, is restricted to 62 miles per hour in the United States, and I think that's a limitation of the ultralight category. The Blackfly's unique canted wings fore and aft provide lift and level flight, easing the burden on the lift rotors. With a 25% reserve, it can fly for about 25 miles before recharge. With a regular 110-volt outlet, it can charge 7 hours, and in only 1 hour using a 220-volt outlet. While version 3 has not yet flown, version 2 has made more than 500 takeoffs and landings, often with worst-case scenario engine failures programmed into the test. Quote, it was built completely with safety in mind, unquote, Eustace said. Like a modern drone, the Blackfly has a go-to-home feature and also auto-land and a ballistic parachute. Version 3 of the Blackfly, they say, will be available for purchase in, get this, 2019, just right around the corner. So while they say they don't have a price yet, Eustace said it will be competitive with the price of an SUV. So electric vertical takeoff and landing may be coming sooner than we all think. By the way, one of the things that struck me when I looked at this design is that it does have a wing built into it, which is pretty unusual. Most of the multi-rotor type systems don't have any wing, and so they're just not as efficient. So the wing, when it's in cruise flight, will reduce the power required to move this thing along, which extends the range. By the way, the 25-mile range is limited because of the weight limit of the ultralight category here in the United States. It'll have longer ranges in countries like Canada, which don't have the same weight limitation in the ultralight category. And they say that although Blackfly has full amphibious capabilities, it's primarily designed to operate from small grassy areas. And this struck me as rather interesting. Even though not required by FAA regulations, Blackfly operators will be required to successfully complete the FAA private pilot written examination and also complete company-mandated vehicle familiarization and operator training. And I looked this up, and I was not familiar with this, but it's true. A single-seat ultralight requires no license to fly, assuming it meets the requirements of Part 103 for ultralight aircraft. Now, any two-seat ultralight or light sport type aircraft requires a sport pilot certificate or higher license to fly. Now, to legally fly an ultralight aeroplane in Canada, if you're presently unlicensed, you must get a pilot permit, quote, ultralight aeroplane. So I was really intrigued by the Blackfly, and certainly it seemed like one of the more promising VTOL designs that I saw when I was at AirVenture. And here's another design that I ranked pretty highly. This comes from AOPA, Sunflyer 2 type certificate in the works. By Aerospace, that an FAA type certificate is in the works for the Sunflyer 2, and company officials expect it to become the first all-electric airplane in the world to receive the agency's blessing. Quote, "We've been flying, and our Part 23 type certificate application has been made," said George Bai, chief executive at Bai Aerospace, which owns the Sunflyer. The company hopes to radically reduce the cost of flight training with electric propulsion. Bai said that direct operating costs for the Sunflyer 2 will be about $3 per flight hour. Now, by the way, that doesn't include the replacement cost for the battery, because batteries wear out. My guess is that pushes the cost up probably closer to $20 an hour. Bai said he expects it'll take about 2 years for certification, and they said the airplane is designed to cruise at 138 knots true at 5,000 feet and climb at about 1,000 feet a minute. Currently has about 3.5 hours endurance, and Bai said that number will rise as battery technology improves. Now, there's also a Sunflyer 4, which is expected to carry 4 people and cruise at 150 knots for up to 4 hours. The German industrial conglomerate Siemens is providing a 90-kilowatt motor for the Sunflyer 2, and it's projected to fly for up to 10,000 hours before overhaul or replacement. Now, that's of the motor. I'm guessing the batteries may have to get replaced sooner than that. It only has one moving part, Bai said. The engine will probably last longer than the airframe. Bai said pilots accustomed to piston engines will be astonished by the lack of noise and vibration, as well as the smoothness of electric propulsion. And from Flying Magazine, in a related story, they say Bai Aerospace also announced it has secured 30 orders for the Sunflyer 2 from Aspen Flying Club, which is based at the same airport as Bai Aerospace at the Centennial Airport near Denver. Now, Aspen Flying Club was not the first flight school to sign up for the Sunflyer. Spartan College signed up for 20 Sunflyers in the early days of development. They say the Sunflyer 2 will be able to fly 2 to 3 flight training sorties without recharging. With a supercharger, a full charge can be achieved in as little as 20 minutes. Bai expects certification for the Sunflyer 2 in 2020. The price for the airplane, $289,000, and the company has taken about 150 deposits to date. And wrapping up our coverage of electric airplane news from AirVenture, this comes from AOPA.org. Pipistrel shows electric airplane battery charger. Pipistrel announced at AirVenture that it's offering a new charging station called SkyCharge for charging eco-friendly aircraft batteries in its electric aircraft models. The SkyCharge station can be set to fast, slow, or maintenance mode. In fast mode, the batteries can be powered in 15 to 20 minutes. The charging stations can charge up to 4 aircraft simultaneously. Quote, "We hear about electric aircraft every day, but we're the only company selling true production aircraft that are certified," said Pipistrel U.S. distributor Michael Coates. The Alpha Electro is certified in Australia as a light sport aircraft, and certification is pending here in the United States. Currently, there are 8 Alpha Electros flying in the United States in the experimental category, and that's because the FAA's current definition of light sport aircraft refers to a single reciprocating engine and hence excludes electric aircraft. Pipistrel says the Alpha Electro can fly for about 1 hour on a fully charged battery. It uses about $3 per hour worth of electricity and costs less than $25 per hour to operate. Coates said the company is moving away from the concept of quick replace batteries, noting that their weight, 115 pounds, is a detriment. Replaceable batteries may not be the way to go, he says. The Alpha Electro trainer sells for $138,000. And a number of those Electro Alpha trainers are here in California, so I'm looking forward to making a visit and see them sometime, and we'll bring you more information about them when I can make that trip. From Flying Magazine, Boeing releases pilot technician forecast. Boeing believes the marketplace will need 635,000 airline pilots for fixed-wing aircraft by 2037, with only 295,000 active pilots worldwide today. That translates to a doubling of the workforce in the next 2 decades. Those requirements break down into 240,000 in the Asia-Pacific region, 127,000 in North America, 118,000 in Europe, 60,000 in the Middle East, and 43,000 in Latin America, and 24,000 in Africa. Around the globe, business aviation will also demand tens of thousands of pilots, and 96,000 to be exact, during this same 20-year period. Boeing said that North America will also need 20,000 helicopter pilots, followed by 14,000 in the Asia-Pacific region, 12,000 in Europe, 6,000 in Latin America. When the topic turns to maintenance technician, the forecast calls for 635,000 on the commercial aviation side, 89,000 in business aviation, and 43,000 for the helicopter industry. Cabin crew are also in short supply, with airlines worldwide in need of approximately 858,000 people, while business aviation will require another 32,000. Fueling the need for additional personnel are record airline profits that translate into the need for more than 14,000 new airplanes valued at more than $6 trillion. Boeing says 56% of the new aircraft will be dedicated to route expansion, while the other 44% will replace older aircraft. And from avweb.com, in what I see as a related story, Boeing plans autonomous flight research center. Boeing has announced plans to open an R&D facility at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's new mixed-use district in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Boeing Aerospace and Autonomy Center will provide space for Boeing subsidiary Aurora Flight Sciences along with Boeing employees. According to Boeing, the work of the facility will, quote, focus on designing, building, and flying autonomous aircraft and developing enabling technologies. Boeing is leading the development of new autonomous vehicles and future transportation systems that will bring flight closer to home, said Boeing Chief Technology Officer Greg Hyslop. Quote, by investing in this new research facility, we are creating a hub where our engineers can collaborate with other Boeing engineers and research partners around the world and leverage the Cambridge innovation ecosystem. Center employees will also help develop new technologies for programs that are part of Boeing's recently announced Next division. That's NEXT. And I should mention that Aurora Flight Sciences was recently purchased by Boeing. That was a company founded by an acquaintance of mine in college, John Langford. And one of the things they have done in the past was they fully automated a Diamond DA-42, which was able to take off and land on its own. So I think if you look 10, 20 years down the road, Boeing and others may be looking to reduce the number of pilots in the cockpit. And I think they'll probably start with cargo aircraft, but who knows, someday we may find that there's one less pilot up front in the cockpit of passenger jets as well. In international news, this comes from pilotweb.aero. A UK pilot seeks judicial review against commercial flying age limits. Earlier this year, Captain Wayne Bailey, a former captain with TUI Airways with nearly 26,000 hours of flying time, turned 65. And under EU aircrew regulations, that meant, of course, he's now prohibited from acting as pilot in command of a commercial air transport. Now, non-EU countries, including Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, did not have upper age limit restrictions on pilots. They base a pilot's competency to fly on medical tests. But the aircrew regulations prevent commercial pilots from flying over the age of 59 unless in the cockpit with another pilot under the age of 60. Additionally, the upper limit of 64, which is the issue in this case, prohibits any flying even when alongside a younger pilot. Captain Bailey said, quote, I believe that the age limit of 64 for commercial pilots is out of date. With suitable medical examinations and precautions, it is perfectly safe for pilots over the age of 64 to fly commercially with another pilot under the age of 60. There is also a clear benefit to the public and the airline industry in having very experienced pilots operating in the UK, and this would also help to address the current shortage of commercial pilots, especially experienced training captains. Well, as you can see, if this captain were able to get the retirement age raised, that would help a little bit with the pilot shortage. But we've got forces working in the opposite direction as well. Back in episode 59, we reported that Representative Bill Schuster had tried to slip a provision into the FAA reauthorization bill that would have required pilots for fractional giant NetJets to retire at age 65. Now, the compromise was that NetJets pilots are now going to be forced to retire at age 70. That plan was worked out with the backing of their union, the NetJets Association of Shared Aircraft Pilots. Also in international news from australianflying.com.au, Basic Class 2 Medical to require a statement for passengers. Pilots flying under the new Basic Class 2 or BC2 Medical will now need to inform passengers that they will be operating under a lower medical standard than that required for a private pilot. Under legislation dated June 28th and applicable from July 2nd, 2018, pilots are now required to tell every passenger or a guardian of every passenger that the pilot does not hold a standard medical certificate required for private pilots. The pilot holds holds a CASA-issued certificate for a lower medical standard that permits use of the pilot's PPL subject to conditions, and the lower medical standard is based on a commercial driver's license. The new BC2 has been introduced to enable pilots flying only simple operations to do so without requiring the Class 2 medical needed for the full privileges of a PPL. The conditions of the BC2 are VFR only, below 10,000 feet, within Australia, piston engine aircraft only, and a maximum takeoff weight less than 8,168 kilograms. Flight activity endorsements such as aerobatics and formation flying are not permitted under the BC2. And from Bloomberg.com comes a story that's not general aviation related, but I include it because I know a number of our listeners will someday be airline pilots, and actually a few of them are already. The story says stale cockpit air may be dulling your airline pilot's performance. They say that airliner cockpits can have levels of carbon dioxide that are elevated enough that in simulations it causes pilots to fail test maneuvers at higher rates than normal, according to a new Harvard University study. First of its kind research suggests that current regulations aren't adequate to assure that there's enough fresh air in airline flight decks. It raises questions about whether even moderately elevated carbon dioxide levels could impact safety, says Joseph Allen, assistant professor at Harvard School of Public Health and the lead author of the study. In recent years, studies have shown that even an increase of a few hundred parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air we breathe causes people to test lower for cognitive skills. But until the latest study, pilots in airline cockpits hadn't been examined. Normal levels in the atmosphere are 400 parts per million for carbon dioxide, and concentrations of this colorless, tasteless gas can rise in poorly vented spaces where people exhale it, like crowded airliners. Carbon dioxide levels reach as high as 1,400 parts per million on 5% of airline flights that the EASA agency tested, according to data it released last year. The average was 603 parts per million, just slightly higher than levels found in the air. Because earlier studies showed people perform more poorly on tests of brain function at levels as low as 1,000 parts per million, researchers thought it would make sense to examine pilot skills and carbon dioxide. 30 airline pilots were recruited to fly multiple 3-hour segments in a special flight simulator in which carbon dioxide levels could be manipulated. Performance on 21 maneuvers, ranging from making a steep turn to handling an emergency engine fire, decreased as carbon dioxide levels rose, according to the study. Flight examiners certified by the FAA rated the pilot's performance. At 700 parts per million, the pilots were 69% more likely to correctly perform the maneuvers compared to when they were breathing carbon dioxide at 2,500 parts per million. At 1,500 parts per million, they were 52% more likely to pass compared to the higher level. And that study was published in the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology. And finally, from avweb.com, it's jail time for a drunk pilot. A former pilot for Alaska Airlines was sentenced to a year and a day in federal prison for flying 2 flights in 2014 with a blood alcohol level more than 3 times the legal limit. David Arntzen, 63, pleaded guilty in February to 1 felony count of operating common carrier while under the influence. Prosecutors said Arntzen had been an alcoholic during a substantial portion of his 20-year airline career and had concealed his drinking from the airline and the FAA. Arntzen also was assessed a $10,000 fine. The maximum penalty for the felony is 15 years in prison. In a statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, prosecutors said Arntzen flew from San Diego to Portland on June 20th, 2014, and then from Portland to John Wayne Airport in Orange County. After landing, Arntzen was selected for random drug and alcohol testing by airline personnel. 2 breathalyzer tests showed Arntzen had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.135% and 0.142%. The federal limit is 0.04. Arntzen later retired from the airline and the FAA revoked his certificates. Quote, "This case sends a message to everyone in the aviation industry that passenger safety is paramount, and we will aggressively investigate and prosecute any threat to that safety," said U.S. Attorney Nick Lahana. And I just wanted to note that for many decades, airline pilots had to hide their alcoholism because they knew that that would lead to firing. However, in the 1970s, changes were made so that pilots who got treatment were able to retain their jobs. And I know this because I met a pilot at the Palm Beach Institute in Florida back in 1975. Gus McDonald, I believe. He used to fly for the old National Airlines. And Gus was a great pilot, enjoyed talking with him. I only know that because my father was being treated for alcoholism at that facility at the time. So that was kind of interesting to meet Gus and some other folks at that institute. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, we're going to be talking about mental health and stress and how it affects pilots. Plus, listener feedback and questions. One listener wants to know what an ANR headset would do for him. He says he flies a Waco UPF-7, and he's been perfectly happy with his David Clarks. Stick around. We'll be right back with answers to those questions and more right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. We'll get to our discussion on mental health and stress in aviation in just a moment. But first, I wanted to give you a few updates on what my week was like at AirVenture, where you might be able to find me this fall at a number of different places I'm going to be around the country, as well as just a few updates of what's been going on in my life over the last couple of weeks. First, I hope you enjoyed the interviews that I recorded at AirVenture in the Lightspeed tent out at Oshkosh. I got to meet a number of you who came up to visit, which was great. So thanks for coming up and stopping by to say hello. I had a nice meeting with Richard McSpadden. He's the head of AOPA's Air Safety Institute, and an interesting discussion. He said that 5 principles really drive the safety approach at ASI. He said those are training, knowledge, proficiency, equipment, and aeronautical decision-making. And he said if you do those 5 things, that safety is really kind of built in automatically. We also talked about the need for the FAA to set more aggressive goals for safety in general aviation. And I think that in the past we've seen the FAA point to the yearly decline in the number of accidents as being significant, when in fact often the decline in number of accidents from year to year is solely because there are fewer hours being flown, and that the underlying rate of accidents hasn't changed all that much. It has been coming down, but both Richard and I feel that the FAA ought to be setting more aggressive goals to get the rate down even lower. One thing that we talked about that we both agree about was speculation. I know often you will hear people say, hey, when there's an accident, pilots shouldn't speculate about what happened. Well, Richard and I are on the same page on that. We agree that it's fine to speculate in some circumstances. And that is, if, of course, you wanted to know exactly what happened for a particular accident, well, speculation won't necessarily get you the correct answer. But if your goal is to educate other pilots about the kinds of things that can lead to a particular accident, well, then speculation makes a lot of sense. He said that people love stories and that we can learn by talking about the maybes that might have happened in these accidents, and I totally agree on that. So great conversation. We'll look to find a way to get him on as a guest here someday in the future. Also talked with dispatcher Mike Wednesday night. We were both in the Pipistrel booth, and he is the host of the Flying in Life podcast, and we recorded a short interview. And if you want to hear me talking with the dispatcher Mike, go on out to his episode 43 of a Flying in Life. And the interview is right near the very beginning of the episode. And he has been on Airplane Geeks podcast, which I'm a co-host on, once or twice, perhaps twice now at this point, and very knowledgeable about the world of dispatching. I've learned a lot from him about what dispatchers do for the airlines. And let's see, on Tuesday, I was presenting in the EAA Pilot Proficiency Tent, gave a presentation on night flying. It was pretty funny. I had to run there because I had just finished doing an interview with Vicky Benzing, and I had to then dash off to give my presentation. While I was there, Antonio from Guatemala came by, and he had one of my books that he has, and he asked me to sign that, so it was a pleasure to meet him, and great that he carried the book all the way up from Guatemala. Talked with Dave and Dave, who flew a Bonanza in from New Hampshire. Also talked with Barrett Caldwell, who is a MIT grad, who's a professor out at Purdue working on weather technology in the cockpit. And let's see who else. Well, it's kind of hard to mention everybody that I ran into, but just a couple of people would be Ernie from Kennebunkport, Maine, Rick Blamer, Jimmy Birch from Australia, Al Evans from the Pilot Safety Podcast, Jennifer, who is an accountant at a major airport in Ohio, who we've had on the Airplane Geeks podcast twice, David Abbey from New York, Len Towler from New Zealand. Let's see who else here. There was Lionel Amaro, who's out of the Vancouver, British Columbia area. He stopped by to say hello. I met Sam Hagen. Sam is Samantha. She and Kyle Faso have a project going on to try and fly to all 50 states, and you can read about them on their Facebook page at facebook.com/adventureabove. Spent a long time at the Pilatus booth talking with Tom Aniolo, who I've known for a long time. He used to be at Cessna. I met him because he bought one of my G1000 books many years ago when he was working on his instrument rating. We talked a lot about the PC-24 jet, which was on display there. He said it was designed because when they talked with their existing PC-12 customers, they said that they wanted to go faster. What they really loved, though, was their cargo door. And so the PC-24 has the same door that's on the PC-12, great big, huge cargo door on the back. Tom said that's really unique among jets. Also something interesting, he said that they offered the jets in 2 blocks of 7 and 84 airplanes, and there was a fixed price for each of the planes built in those different blocks. Then they close the order books until they're done building, and they will eventually open up the order books again for a new block of planes after they have enough experience building them and have determined what their true manufacturing costs are, which I thought was a very sensible approach to pricing something complex like an airplane like that. He also mentioned the PC-9 and PC-21 military trainers, which I was not familiar with, which are built by Pilatus and used by about a dozen air forces around the world. He said that they can program these aircraft so that it responds like a jet that the pilots are training for. For example, an F-15, you can program the PC-9 or the 21 so that the power ramps up more slowly than it would in a turboprop, but to represent what would happen in the F-15. And let's see, other listeners I ran into, Sam Wiltsius. He's Wired for Flight on Twitter. He's out of Madison, Wisconsin. I saw my good friend Peter King. Peter used to live here in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is now working for Epic and is in charge of their training, as I recall. What I hadn't realized is that Epic, which I've known for a long time, which builds a very large experimental home-built aircraft, has decided to switch gears, and they are now going to be selling certificated versions of the Epic. And I believe that's going to start shipping sometime next year, provided their certification comes through from the FAA. So that's rather exciting. I think that's going to make it a little easier for folks to get into a high-performance aircraft like that rather than to have to go through the logistics of building it themselves. And I spent a whole lot of time with my good friend Rob Mark. I didn't realize till afterwards I hadn't seen him for 6 years and hardly missed a beat. It just seemed like we picked up right where the relationship was the last time we were at AirVenture together. But of course, he and I talked almost weekly for many years as a co-host on the Airplane Geeks podcast. So he just retired from that show a couple of months ago. He's now, of course, senior editor for Flying Magazine. Always a great person to talk to about many, many things. He's also an active flight instructor. So we had some discussions about a particular flight student he was having some questions about how to work with. So that was kind of fun as well. Anyway, AirVenture was awesome. I look forward to seeing all of you there next year if you didn't make it out there this year. Now, if you're not able to make it to AirVenture, and of course all pilots are required to get there at least once in their lifetime, here are some other places where I'll be this fall where you might want to come by and say hello. I'm going to be at the AOPA Regional Fly-Ins. The one in Santa Fe, New Mexico will be September 14th and 15th. I'm teaching the Advanced IFR Seminar on Friday. Now, the seminars on Friday, you have to pay to attend those. I think it's around $100, and you can then attend all the seminars you want all day on Friday. Same is going to be true at Carbondale, Illinois for the regional fly-in. That's going to be October 5th through the 6th. Oddly, I was in Carbondale for the first time ever last year to watch the eclipse since my uncle lived there in town there. And then finally, Gulf Shores, Alabama to wrap up the regional fly-ins for AOPA. That's going to be October 26th to the 27th. Again, I'll be teaching the Advanced IFR Seminar on Friday for each of those 3 weekends. Now, here's another event that may interest you, especially if you own or fly a higher power piston aircraft, something like a Cessna 182 or 206, or maybe a Mooney, a higher performance Piper, a Beechcraft, or even a Cirrus. This event's going to be held in Las Vegas on October 11th to 14th. And essentially what you're going to do is fly into the Henderson Executive Airport. All the seminars and trade shows are going to be at the Grass Valley Resort and Spa. And I don't want you to get dissuaded by the name of this event because I think it's just equally valuable to all these different owners of different types of aircraft. The name of the event is Cirrus Migration 16. So it's the 16th annual event where Cirrus owners and like-minded people get together. Now, why would you want to come to a Cirrus event if you're flying one of these other airplanes? Well, here's why. I have seen many of the presenters and the presentations that will be given there. And while a few of them are specific to the Cirrus, the vast majority, probably over 80% of the information and the vendors you're going to see at the trade show there, they apply to any piston aircraft, but particularly to higher performance ones. So it's a great opportunity to learn more about the airplane you fly. It's also a great opportunity to learn more about Cirrus. And if you're thinking that you might want to start to fly or even buy a Cirrus someday, you should come to that event because you're going to learn more in a couple of days than you would probably any other way. The arrival starts on Thursday, October 11th, especially for people who want to take the owner maintenance class that runs from 10 to 5 p.m. That day. And then the Copacabana party, that's kind of cute, right? Copacabana, because it's sponsored by the Cirrus Owner Pilots Association, or COPA, is going to be on Thursday night. Friday, the general session starts at 8:30 a.m. Then there are seminars throughout the day, including one that I'm teaching on night flying. The trade show opens from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And sometimes vendors have show specials, so you might want to check out and see if they're offering a discount on something. Saturday is going to be more of the same with seminars and the trade show, plus there's a spouses program that runs from 10:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. And finally, there's a banquet on Saturday night. I'll put a link in this to the show notes, but you can find it by going out to migration.cirruspilots.org. And I'll look forward to meeting you there if you're going to be there. And now let's talk for a couple minutes about some of my recent flying activities. First, we got a new Class Bravo here in the San Francisco Bay Area starting on August the 16th. And I got to say, I'm a little bit disappointed with it. You know, if you look at design in general, it's well established that people prefer curved lines over straight lines for a variety of reasons. A lot of the straight lines and angles and so on are just considered more harsh. But guess what we got? We've lost our nice set of lovely concentric circles, and we have a random set of polygons, which have absolutely no symmetry at all. You know, if we were going to go to polygons, you could take a look at the Seattle Class Bravo. It's got a lot of nice symmetry. And the benefit of symmetry is if you're flying to the airport from the west or flying from the east, you don't have to look at the chart because all of the step downs are the same. You get the same altitudes and same step downs regardless of which direction you're coming from. Not the case here any longer in San Francisco. So you've got to memorize a seemingly random set of altitudes that just don't have a lot of consistency to them as you're flying back toward your home airport from one direction versus another. And so it also means that you pretty much need to have a moving map in the airplane to identify the lines. In the past, one could do it with DME, with VOR, and so on. Those days are gone. So what can I say? I'm sure the new airspace will work, but for me personally, I have started decluttering my screen and turning off the Bravo when I'm flying around because I just find it too ugly. So what can I say? I sure wish they had stuck with something that was more aesthetically pleasing from a design standpoint, but obviously that was not their primary consideration. And I was watching what I thought was going to be an accident this past Friday. Fortunately, the pilot pulled it out, but honestly, I thought for a couple of minutes there I was going to be watching the demise of a pilot and airplane right in front of my eyes. And so the circumstances were that I was sitting in the run-up area of runway 31 at Palo Alto, getting ready to take off in 31 with a pilot I was flying with, and we were looking down, and suddenly we saw an airplane fly low in front of us, going from left to right. And my first thought was, they switched runways. This pilot just departed from runway 13. And then I realized, no, this Cessna 172 is having a lot of trouble climbing. It's just barely, above the fence, and it's not climbing rapidly. It had 10 degrees of flaps in. So I started to realize that they must have taken off of runway 31, had some type of engine problem. And in fact, I did hear someone on the radio say that they could hear the engine sounded like it was not producing full power. So they apparently made a teardrop turn back to the runway for whatever reason, were not able to land, I'm guessing because they had a bit of a tailwind. And so they continued on and then made yet another teardrop to come back to approach runway 31. They were able to gain a little bit of altitude during that turn, and they also raised the flaps. So what I noticed was by the time they got turned around that they were just slightly high on final, and they forgot to redeploy the flaps. So they floated down the entire length of the runway and then went off the runway a little bit to the right near the very end of the runway, which closed the runway and which ultimately we decided to give up on our flight because we couldn't tell how long the runway was going to be closed. We did get to watch 3 police cars go screaming right in front of us as they went onto the runway. The fire trucks were on the way, but they were sent back because there were fortunately no injuries. So all I can tell you is it's a little disturbing to watch an airplane and think that you're going to be watching an accident, but I'm very happy that they were able to pull that out. And of course, we did talk about the impossible turn back in episode 68, which turned out, by the way, to be one of our most popular episodes. So apparently this aircraft did do the impossible turn, but I will point out that they were not completely power out. They had some power, which would help make that more possible. On the other hand, there's always a risk anytime you have a reduction in power that if you think that that's going to, stay that way and give you enough time to get back to the runway, even at reduced power, you're overlooking one key fact, which is that given that there was already one problem which caused your engine output to reduce, there could be additional problems which might cause the engine to quit altogether. So just because you might be running, hundreds of RPM below normal power, don't assume that it will stay that way because, something went wrong to get you to that point. There's no guarantee that it will continue to stay at the reduced power. It can get worse. So, this pilot obviously felt that it was worth the risk to try and turn it around and bring it back, and that certainly proved to be the case. But, had the engine quit altogether, things might have turned out a little bit differently. Now, you've probably heard in the news that we have all kinds of wildfires and smoke here in California, and I would tell you that I have barely seen blue sky here for the entire month of August. Today, actually, we had a fair amount of blue sky for the first time in the month, and that's just because we have gray skies with smoke. Even though the nearest fires are over 100 miles away, they are upwind from us. The prevailing winds come from the northwest, and so we've had a lot of smoke. A few days ago, the smoke was as low as 2-mile visibility at the Palo Alto airport. I flew one lesson in which we started with 8-mile visibility. In the course of an hour and a half, we watched visibility vary considerably while we were in the air. I gave a PIREP that it was down to 2.5 miles in one direction and 4 miles in all other directions. And then a few minutes after we landed, the field went IFR with a tower calling it as 2-mile visibility. So that was that was pretty bad. Not only that, after a while, you start to notice that your throat feels a little scratchy and your eyes might feel a little watery. I had a pilot who was all ready to fly immediately afterwards, and he looked pretty disappointed when I said, I'm not going back up in that stuff again. And I said, it's not good for my health. And he kind of said, okay, I understand. And I went on to say, and it's not good for your health either. So I went back to the house, stayed inside all day with the windows closed. Often we open our windows at night for the fresh air. We didn't do it that night. We just left the house closed up so that we could keep all that particulate matter out and hopefully minimize breathing it. Now, regular listeners may have noticed that I've not had a new episode up the last 2 weeks, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One of which is, I was just exhausted after I got back from AirVenture. Plus, I had a lot of catch-up work to do. But I've been working on another project, which I'll be telling you about here in a moment, which has taken up a lot of my time. And I'm going to be talking about that on the Simple Flight radio show on September the 9th. Now, that's a live show that's done over the internet. I met one of the co-hosts, Mark Epner, at AirVenture. He invited me onto the show. But you don't have to listen to it live because it's available afterwards as a podcast. So you can just go out to the website at simpleflight.net or search in Apple iTunes or any podcast app for Simple Flight. Again, that's going to be at 8 p.m. Central Time on September the 9th. And, here's what I'm going to be doing. I'm headed out to Knoxville to Cirrus, where I will be doing my type rating in the Vision Jet. So I'm quite excited about this. There are probably only 50 or so Vision Jets out there. So it's going to be quite exciting, and I'll tell you folks about how that goes. It's about 2 weeks of training with a whole lot of preparation to get ready for it. And the reason I wanted to do this is I just wanted to be at the cutting edge of something new. There are probably probably about 700 Cirrus jets due to be delivered over the next 7 or 8 years or so. And I thought I'd just get in on the ground floor so that I can do some work in teaching in the Vision Jet in the future. Now, it's going to be expensive. This is going to cost about the amount of a really nice used car. So anyway, September is going to be a fairly negative cash flow month, but it should be a lot of fun, and I will share all of those things with you. Hey, this is the time of the show where I always talk about new Patreon supporters, and we have a lot since I haven't had a new show out for a number of weeks now, but like to thank the people who've joined us over that time frame. They include Bill Ayer, Edward Varso, Robert Kirsch, Ramel Jacinto, Kevin Bremer, Chris Carnahan, Robert Nelson, Ron Steele, Andrew Sinclair, Anthony Pitt, Michael Hill, Bill Crahan, Wade Jackson, and Jeffrey Bell. And I want to thank them as well as all of our other Patreon supporters who contribute each month. As I've mentioned before on the show, we don't have advertisers, but we do have expenses, so I greatly appreciate the monthly contributions. And since this is the first news show of the month, I read the names of our biggest super supporters, who each contribute at least $20 a month. And they are Jerry Zawadny, who's a software developer, Peter Long from Australia, a friend of mine who's a CFI, Seth Lake, military instructor pilot in Arkansas. You can find his blog, gonogo.aero, where he talks about his podcast and flight school. Jason Blair, who's been on the show a number of times. He's a DPE and runs a blog at jasonblair.net. Joseph Haggerty, who's a Mooney pilot and owner. Michael Rogers, Cirrus owner and pilot in Southern California. Michael Spain, student pilot in Oklahoma who's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Larry Noe from New York City. He flies a Bonanza G36. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, proud owners and operators of 3 Cessna T240 aircraft. Roger Griggs, he used to fly a TBM 850. He now has a Meridian 600. Chuck Price, he's at TooSimple.ai, which is a company which is doing artificial intelligence with trucks. And Don Dillman, he's a professional pilot who runs a training center for a large aviation company. He owns a Bonanza F-33A, and he's just reinstated his CFI. Stella Sue, who's a student pilot in the SR20, and we've posted a Facebook Live video of her before on the Patreon site. Jonathan Weisswasser, he's a vascular surgeon, also a ham radio operator like me, and flies a Meridian. Jim Barrett, down in the Monterey area, he runs Sonics ESD, which specializes in active noise control, and we brought his Cirrus SR20 back from the factory just a couple of months ago. Fabio Cumlos, who's an SR22 owner who I flew with recently. Lance Fletcher, he's a former crew chief in the Air Force on the F-111F, and he is just starting to learn how to fly, which is great. Joseph Morales, he's a patent lawyer in Maryland who's a former National Guard Black Hawk pilot. Moj Kazi, he's a software developer here in Silicon Valley who's been helping me with time to time at the aviationnewstalk.com website. Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of ForeFlight, which I'm sure most of you know is the most popular iOS flight planning app here in the U.S. I want to thank him for his generous support. Adam Nunn, who is out of Texas and flies a Piper Cherokee, and 3 new people who I have yet to contact, so I'll let you know next month after I have a little bit more about each of them, but they are Chris Carnahan, Anthony Pitt, and Jeffrey Bell. Thank you all so much for being super supporters, and if you love the show and you'd like to have just a little bit more of Aviation News Talk when we're done, just go on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you can see what we have to offer you. There are a lot of posts which you can read for free and photos that I've taken while flying around. Anybody can view. And right now there is a video that I posted several weeks ago, which I'll be talking about as we talk about our main topic in just a few moments. And so what you can probably figure out is that our Patreon supporters often find out a few weeks ahead of time about things we'll be talking about on the show because I post things first on the Patreon site. And if you're a Patreon supporter, you'll get an email every time something new gets posted. And that's usually once, twice, sometimes 3 times a week. Now stick around because in just a few seconds, we're going to be back to talk about mental health and stress. Welcome back. Let's talk a little bit about mental health in aviation, especially depression among pilots, because I think it's a serious issue that just doesn't get discussed enough in the aviation press. And part of the reason I want to talk about it is that we've had 2 pilot suicide accidents that have occurred within 3 days of each other, and that's, I think, unprecedented. So first, we'll talk a little bit about those 2 incidents, and then we'll talk about what studies show about pilots and depression. Finally, we'll talk about 2 incidents, one fatal and one that resulted in a pilot deviation, both related to stress and fatigue as a result of the death in one case of a family member and in the other case of a close friend. Now, we all have family members and friends who die, but we don't talk much about the serious effect the loss of a loved one can have on our flying abilities, so that's why I want to bring these cases up as well. So we talked in the beginning of the show about the Horizon Air-8 Q400 that was stolen from SeaTac on August 10th. I'm going to play some of the recordings from that day, and I'd like to thank liveatc.net for providing the audio. Now, we don't have all of the audio from that day yet, as some of the feeds at liveatc.net have more than one ATC frequency on the same feed, so when multiple frequencies become active at the same time, we can't always hear what was being said on one or more of those frequencies. Now, the FAA, of course, has 100% of all those recordings, and I'm sure that more of them will come out over time as part of the NTSB investigation. What we do know is that Richard Russell, the 29-year-old who stole the Q400, was a Horizon Air ground service operator, and he worked as part of a tow team that repositions aircraft on the airport. Now, he worked for the company for about 4 years and had authorized access to the planes, though, of course, he wasn't authorized to fly them, and apparently he didn't have a pilot certificate. Now, Russell apparently boarded the airplane at the cargo area at the north end of the field, started the aircraft, and then taxied out to runway 16 center. Listen now as a SeaTac controller tries to contact the plane.
Aircraft on Charlie, lining up runway 16 center, say your call sign. The dash 8 on runway 16 center, say your call sign. The dash 8 on runway 16 center, say your call sign. Who is the dash 8 holding on runway 16 center? Horizon 2728, verify you're in the left turn.
Ready to turn Horizon 2728.
Horizon 2728, thank you, contact departure.
Departure, see you.
Down in Alaska, 322. That aircraft was set behind the Horizon when he was taking off forward.
Who's the aircraft on runway 16 center?
His wheels are smoking left and right. Right now he's rolling down the runway.
Alright, I'm not even talking to him.
He came flying out of the cargo area in front of Delta.
Which cargo area, 1 or 2?
The one that's furthest to the north. Sorry, you need to call and scramble now.
No, we are.
Note that one pilot said the tires were smoking, suggesting that Russell may have had the brakes on while taxiing. And then a pilot said, "Time to call and scramble now." Now, of course, he was referring to sending up fighter jets to intercept the stolen aircraft since its intentions were totally unknown. And indeed, a pair of F-15s were scrambled from the 142nd Fighter Wing of the Oregon Air National Guard at the Portland International Airport. Reports are that they flew supersonically to get to the scene, and sonic booms were reported on the ground. There's ATC audio available of controllers talking to the F-15s, and you can find that on the internet if you're interested. Now let's listen to some clips of Russell talking with controllers and pilots. Listen in particular to the tone of his conversation, how he sounds like he's having the time of his life, and yet at the same time he talks from time to time about ending it all.
Hey, is that pilot on? I want to know what this weather's going to be like in the Olympics.
Well, if you can see the Olympics, the weather's good. I can see the Olympics from my window, and it looks pretty good over there.
All right, because I hit some, felt like turbulence around right near, but there was no clouds hardly.
Oh, that's just the wind blowing over all the bumpy surfaces there.
Oh, copy that.
Yeah, but Rich, if you could, maybe start a left-hand turn, start turning back around, because if you get too close to the Olympics, you won't be able to hear us anymore.
I got a lot of people that care about me, and it's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it until now. Just kind of lightheaded, dizzy. Man, and the sights went by so fast, too. I was thinking, like, I'm going to have this moment of serenity, I'll be able to take in all the sights. And, there's a lot of pretty stuff, but think they're prettier in a different context. I'm going to land it, in a safe kind of manner. I think I'm going to try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, now I'm just going to nose down and call it a night.
And of course, when he says pointing it nose down and calling it a night, it sounds very much like he is talking about pointing the aircraft at the ground and ending his life.
Well, Rich, before you do that, let's think about this. I got another pilot coming up, Pilot Joel, here in just a minute or two, I hope. And we'll be able to give you some advice on what to do next.
Alaska 376. I'll get you going as soon as I can. The aircraft in front of you is talking to an airplane in the air. So he can't move quite yet, but I'll get you going as soon as I can.
Oh, got it. Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep.
At one point during the flight, apparently Russell succeeded in looping the aircraft, but then still wanted to do a barrel roll.
All right, Rich, this is Captain Bill. Congratulations, you did that. Now let's try to land that airplane safely and not hurt anybody on the ground.
All right. Damn it. I don't know, man. I don't know. I don't want to. I was kind of hoping that was going to be it, you know?
So he sounds almost euphoric after having performed a loop, but at the same time, he apparently was hoping that would end his life, but it didn't.
I'm just going to do this barrel roll real quick.
Well, no need to do that. If you could just start a turn to the right, and then I'll tell you when to stop turning, and then you can keep it level from there.
I feel like I need to be, what do you think, like 5,000 feet at least to be able to pull this barrel roll off?
And it was apparently the barrel roll that ended his life, as he apparently did not complete it successfully. There were also conversations on the frequency about the status of his fuel. It sounds like he was running low on fuel. At one point he mentioned it sounded like an engine was quitting, so we don't really know for sure exactly what happened, and we'll know more in the days ahead. Now, there have been a number of articles written, people commenting on this. There was a Reverend Peter Bauer who was on plane inbound to Seattle as the stolen plane was being flown. And he wrote recently in thriveglobal.com about that experience because the people on board were aware as they were flying towards Seattle of the drama that was unfolding. He said, maybe the big takeaway for all of us from this tragedy is how do we encourage more people to feel free to share what is really happening in their lives, especially the painful and scary experiences with someone who is willing to listen without judgment and to offer care and comfort. And from the FordhamObserver.com, the opinions editor, Owen Roche, said it shouldn't have taken a stolen plane and daredevil flight patterns to reveal to Richard Russell and everyone around him that he needed help. Drastic measures, including those that are less daring than Russell's, are the result of too many unanswered cries for recognition, for understanding. It takes a community to uplift and acknowledge the individual, and it takes a country to accept mental health as a threat that manifests behind a facade of normalcy. Some of the most exciting moments of his life were his last. His story is finished. We must be diligent to ensure that those after him can rewrite their endings with recognition, understanding, support, and happy landings. Now, oddly, just 2.5 days later, a similar incident occurred, though it wasn't nearly as widely reported as the one we've just discussed. From avweb.com, a professional pilot, Dwayne Yaud, stole his employer's Cessna Citation 525 jet and deliberately crashed it into his own house in Payson, Utah, about 2:30 a.m., according to police reports. Yaud's wife and a boy who were in the house escaped without injury. The house was heavily damaged and the jet was destroyed by fire. Yaud, age 47, had been arrested about 7:30 p.m. on Sunday in a nearby canyon after witnesses called police to report he was assaulting his wife. He was held in a local jail for several hours and then released on bail. The couple had gone to the canyon to talk over their problems and reportedly had been drinking. Within hours of his release, Yaud drove to the Spanish Fork Springville Airport about 15 miles north of his home and took off in his employer's jet. He flew directly to his neighborhood and smashed into the house. Court records show Yaud had previously been charged with disorderly conduct after a domestic violence incident in April and was released on probation and ordered to attend counseling. We'll talk more about counseling and talk therapy in just a moment, but first I want to share the results of a survey that was done in the aftermath of the German Wings crash in which the pilot committed suicide, killing all of the passengers on board the aircraft. And this comes from RD.com. It says a survey in May 2015 found that a surprising percentage of pilots aren't as happy-go-lucky as you might think. Hoping to shed light on depression and suicidal thoughts among airline pilots, researchers at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health anonymously surveyed 1,848 pilots around the world. They found that 12.6% met the criteria for likely depression. 75 participants, or 4.1%, reported having thoughts of being better off dead or of self-harm within the past 2 weeks. In comparison, an estimated 6.7% of all U.S. adults had at least one major depressive episode in the past year, according to the National Institute of Mental Health. The study speculated that underreporting of mental health systems and diagnoses is probable among airline pilots who self-disclose mental disorders to the FAA's medical examiners due to the public stigma of mental illness and fear of being grounded or not fit for duty. Researchers also suggested that shift work and continuous hours, which make scheduling treatment difficult, could serve as barriers to seeking treatment. Additionally, the study argued that piloting commercial aircraft was a high-stress occupation in its own right. And here's a related posting from Australia. This comes from news.com.au. It says, Karen Phillips is an Australian counselor who has worked with a number of pilots. She confirmed that there is a stigma around mental health medication and treatment and that pilots fear it will be viewed detrimentally. Quote, they think it means they're unable to cope with the pressure of their job. That's not the truth at all. They could be having relationship problems or problems with their children, Dr. Phillips said. Their work hours are crazy and they're constantly sleep deprived. They often have relationship difficulties simply because they're not around. She said the best way to manage depression is with regular confidential checkups. Quote, our society is very reactive. We wait for someone to go down, then get help. With a pilot, that's the worst thing to do, especially with hundreds of lives in their hands. And the FAA has recognized that depression is an issue for pilots. There's a great article on their website written by Glenn Stoutt. He's a senior aviation medical examiner, or one of the people who gives medical exams to pilots. It's called Just for the Health of Pilots. I'll post a link to it in the show notes. It's much longer than I'm going to be able to read here, but let me pick out a few excerpts from it. He says, depression covers a huge spectrum. It does not just refer to the days when we feel blue, have the blahs, or down the dumps. Everyone has days like that. The question to ask in evaluating depression is, what is the degree of impairment in one's life that depression is causing? Depression is not only the most common mental disorder, but also the most treatable, with an 80 to 90% success rate. The foundation of all treatment is a combination of psychotherapy, or talk therapy, and psychopharmacology. Both complement each other. He says there are 4 ways to strengthen your defenses. 1, avoid booze. Alcohol abuse is probably just an attempt at self-medicating feelings of depression. Alcohol always makes depression worse. It is used not so much to feel good as it is to avoid feeling bad. Many depressed people with hangovers jump out of hotel windows on Sunday mornings. Avoid it. 2, exercise more. All studies positively stress the use of exercise. Exercise releases endorphins, the body's joy juice. It's probably responsible for the runner's high. He says large muscle activity in the thighs in particular may help discharge feelings of pent-up frustration, anger, and hostility. He says anger turned inwardly is a major cause of fatigue and depression. The downside of this wonderfully effective treatment is that most depressed people just don't have the energy or motivation to get up and exercise. Number 3, he says, is forgive yourself. Don't try to be perfect. Remember that there are more than 6 billion people on Earth, and hundreds of thousands of them can do even better what you do best. 4, open up more. Men just don't want to admit of anything that takes away from the macho image. Depression is thought of as a wimp disorder. Men may just tough it out until the Smith & Wesson cure seems the only solution. Of course, he's referring to people who commit suicide with a firearm, which is not much different than people who are committing suicide with an airplane. He says the macho Marlboro man would do better to open his feelings up, show some intimacy, and admit that things are not going so well for him. Women outlive us by an average of 7 years. Some of this may be not only from estrogen, but also from a willingness to talk intimately to friends about problems, even to admit that they have problems. He says depression doesn't mean the end of a flying career. Under some circumstances, pilots being treated for depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders can continue flying or return to flying, depending upon the severity of the problem. And I'm going to go ahead and include links here to that particular webpage, and also to a separate page that provides guidance to aviation medical examiners on the use of antidepressant medications. And just to wrap up this portion of the discussion on depression, I want to play a short clip from the Airplane Geeks podcast from about a month ago when my co-host and friend Brian Coleman resigned from the show. And he shared a little about himself that my fellow co-host and I were totally unaware of. Here's that clip.
I also have on and off been suffering from depression. And it's not something that I've talked about or share with people, but I feel as though since this is my last show as a regular co-host, I could do it. So a little bit ago, getting back to the mental health, I considered taking my own life. Now, before you get all upset, the story has a very happy ending. I'm still here, right? Anyway, I'm not here to talk about my issues or my challenges per se. What I wanted to do was give a shout out to the podcasting community and ask for your support. By listening to podcasts, and I'm talking about all podcasts, not just Airplane Geeks or Airline Pilot Guy or Plane Talking UK or all the other great aviation podcasts, I was actually listening to a discontinued podcast that saved my life. So I told you this was a serious and important topic. Anyway, the podcast is produced by this great company called Gimlet Media, and the show is called Undone. The particular episode that saved my life is entitled The Columbia. Some of you may have listened to it, and if you haven't, please do me a favor and listen to the podcast. I've asked Max to put the episode URL in the show notes. In addition to giving the show a listen, please support content producers of the great shows that you love listening to. These shows cost time, money to produce, and even if you think they don't need the money, I could pretty much guarantee you that they do. And if you can't afford to contribute financially, please give them a rating in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. Also, please tell your friends about the podcasts and how great they are. The ratings and reviews really help. And I'm still amazed how many people don't know what podcasts are, let alone listen to them. Therefore, a great way of helping and supporting your favorite shows are to tell your friends about them and encourage them to listen and contribute financially if they can. You can also send a simple email or provide some feedback to the show. I'm certain that people will appreciate hearing from you just as much as we at the Airplane Geeks appreciate hearing from you. So with that, I wanted to share with you the particular moment of the show Undone, the Columbia, that saved my life. It's a short little clip, but it made a huge impact on me. And the setup for the clip is the description that's found in their show notes. In 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia was returning from 2 weeks in orbit. It was a routine mission, so routine that most Americans barely paid attention, until something went terribly wrong. Many of us watched the shuttle break apart over Texas on television. All 7 of the crew members were lost. John Clark's wife, Laurel, was one of them, and her death that day inspired his life's work, getting more people into space. So please, help inspire others by supporting your favorite podcasts. You just might end up saving a life and doing something really important along the way. This is Brian Coleman, your former associate producer and now contributor at large of the Airplane Geeks podcast. Max, if you could play that little segment, I'd really appreciate it.
You can hear it in John's voice when he talks about this stuff. He really does just think space exploration is awesome. That's not true of everybody Laurel left behind. Her son Ian has no interest in spaceflight. It took his mom from him after all. And John gets that. After Laurel died, John says he stopped taking as many risks, worried about leaving Ian with no parents. He gave up flying small airplanes, for instance. But Ian is grown up now. And even though John probably knows more about the dangers of spaceflight than just about anyone else on Earth, he says if he got the chance, he'd go.
Shoot, yeah. I don't care how risky it is. I don't care if it's a guarantee that I would die, I would still do it. I'd go to Mars tomorrow.
That one simple line from John changed my life.
And thank goodness it did. So I used to talk with Brian every week as we recorded the Airplane Geeks podcast along with our other co-host, and none of us knew that Brian was suffering at the time from depression or that he was even close to ending his own life. But he found something to grasp onto that inspired him and kept him from committing suicide. And he also spoke very bravely and publicly and shared with people about that low point in his life. So talking and sharing how you're feeling does help if and when you're feeling depressed and or suicidal. And some percentage of pilots, just like everybody else in the population, will feel that way at some point in their life. So if you ever feel that way, let someone know. And if you're on the other side of the conversation, try to find some help for your friend. Now, I want to switch gears here because depression is not the only mental health issue that affects pilots. The death of a family member or of a close friend happens to all of us at some time in our lives. But as pilots, we may not be aware of how deeply those deaths can affect our flying skills. So I want to share 2 stories about how a death adversely affected pilots' flying abilities. Now, if you've ever seen the video that was produced a few years ago by AOPA's Air Safety Institute entitled No Greater Burden, then you probably remember this accident. Jay Hopkins of Flying Magazine wrote about that video in his column in Flying Magazine. I'll include a link to the article as well as to the video, and I'm just going to read a little bit from Jay's article. He said, the pilot involved in the fatal accident, Russ Jeter, personally provided the funding for this 32-minute video. He speaks forthrightly in the video about how shocked he was that as an air transport-rated ATP pilot with more than 4,000 hours, who always used a checklist and always does a GUMPS check, that is, checking gas, undercarriage, mixture, and prop, on final, even in fixed-gear airplanes, that he could make the basic mistake of landing an amphibious float plane on a lake with the landing gear extended. Jeter talks about the accident, his unsuccessful attempts to rescue his son, the devastating impact the accident and his son's death has had on him, and his personal quest to understand what could have led him to make such a basic mistake. Because of Jeter's willingness to share his story, we get a rare glimpse into some of the subtle but deadly behind-the-scenes factors that are undoubtedly involved in many accidents. With the help of a specialist in human factors, Jeter realized that the death of his mother only 12 days before the accident had resulted in a sleep deficit. Even though he was spending the same amount of time in bed as he usually did, he was not sleeping well. The morning of the accident, he was aware that he was a little groggy and didn't wake up as quickly as he usually did, but he didn't think much about it. Yet that lack of sleep, coupled with a distraction of talking with his young son right up to short final, led him to fail to check whether the gear was up before landing on the lake. It is truly admirable that Jeter was not only willing but anxious to share his story in the hope that it could help other pilots avoid a similar mistake, and the AOPA Foundation did a very professional job in presenting his message in a personal and compelling fashion. His accident is important because it illustrates that even safe professional pilots who stay current are continually learning and would never think of taking a risk like flying low or trying to push through bad weather, can still have an accident due to something as simple as not getting enough sleep. And I recall from the video that Jeter had flown his Cessna 206 float plane the day before by himself with no issues whatsoever, but he concluded after working with a therapist that the added distraction of having his son in the cockpit, his son was relatively young, was sufficient to distract him from performing the tasks that he would normally perform, tasks that he was able to do by himself when he was alone, but that he was not able to do when he had the added distraction of his son in the cockpit. Now, the video was first introduced to the public at the AOPA Aviation Summit, and I can't remember if it was the one in 2011 in Hartford or the one the following year in Tampa, but I was there and I spoke briefly with Russ Jeter and thanked him for creating the video, which is incredibly powerful. So I want to encourage everybody to click on the link in the show notes. You can also find it at our webpage at aviationnewstalk.com. And watch the video. It runs about 30 minutes. It's well worth your time. You're going to learn a lot about how tragedy can affect us and how it can affect our flying, and certainly how it resulted in this particular accident. Now, Russ posted on YouTube last year in 2017, he said, 6 years ago today, I had the accident in the video, and not a day goes by that I don't regret or relive part of it. I appreciate the vast majority of the people who have thanked me for the video. I would never wish the horror on anybody, and I pray that the video might have influenced some pilots into being safer or more understanding of their condition relative to flying than I did on January 22nd, 2011. Now, I thought of that when earlier this year, a pilot who I taught the private pilot license to had a similar issue, fortunately with a far less drastic outcome. And it was all because, as we kind of talked back through what led up to this particular incident, he had lost a friend And as we talked about it, I asked the pilot if he'd slept okay the night before, and he said that he hadn't. He said that he lost a dear family friend who was a pilot 10 days before in an airplane crash, and that he had just attended the man's funeral in New York the prior week. It seemed likely to me, after talking with him, that this pilot was still grieving over the loss of his friend, which led him to being a little bit distracted, which led to the incident, which I'll just describe to you there. So in his summary, he said that at about 11 in the morning, he was in the run-up area of a runway 31 of the local airport. He said he was told to pull up and hold short of runway 31 for one arrival. An aircraft then landed, taxied to the end of the runway, and immediately afterwards, the tower then spoke to an aircraft that was on downwind and said, Cessna 3 Zulu Kilo, turn base 1 Skylane, which is the plane that my friend was in. 1 Skylane will depart prior to your arrival. Number 1 cleared for the option. Now, my friend, having just heard this instruction referencing his airplane, but of course the instruction was not being addressed to him, somehow thought that that instruction was for him sitting there on the ground, and he gave his call sign and said, cleared for the option 3-1, and then began pulling onto the runway and took off. Obviously, there are a couple different mistakes there. First of all, the instruction was not for him. Second of all, it was a landing instruction, not a takeoff instruction. After we pulled out onto the runway, the tower cleared him for takeoff. He did 3 laps around the pattern. And when he finished flying, the ground alerted him to a possible pilot deviation, which he hadn't been aware of until that particular point. So this was another case of someone who was still suffering some upset from a death of in this case, a close friend, and it really led to some fatigue and some distraction to make a mistake that turned out to be pretty benign in this case, but really could have been quite serious if there had been another aircraft, for example, landing just as he pulled onto the runway. As we talked about it later on, he said that one of the keys that he learned from this incident was the importance of active listening. He said, don't just read back the instruction. Ask yourself, what does it mean? And then do it. Now, in the aftermath of this, there was a report filed with a local FAA FSDO, and we got ahead of that. He went ahead and got some remedial flight training before the FAA ever called the local flying club about this particular incident. And when they did finally call, it was really just a pretty, matter of fact of asking a number of questions, filling in a form, and I think that was pretty much the end of it since the remedial training had already been done. So my suggestion these days is anytime you have any type of pilot deviation, immediately get some remedial flight training, have that documented so when the FAA calls, they know that you took it seriously and that you immediately got some additional training related to that particular incident. And that's going to wrap up our discussion on mental health and stress in pilots today. Go ahead and check in the show notes for links to the video that I mentioned, and also for folks who are using our dedicated app, either for iOS or for Android. I'm going to go ahead and upload a PDF of the article that was written by Glenn Stoutt, the Aviation Medical Examiner, on depression. So you'll be able to download that PDF directly there, or you can also find a link to it in our show notes. Now, I had promised to give you a listener question related to automatic noise reduction headsets. I'm going to go ahead and postpone that to next week since the show is running a little longer than I thought it was going to. So in the meantime, if you think that someday you might be interested in buying a newer, slightly used Cirrus, yep, you know what I'm going to tell you. Please consider contacting me now so that I can help arrange a free demo flight for you if you're thinking about a new Cirrus and help you understand the many factors, not all of which are obvious, in buying a new versus a slightly used Cirrus. I specialize in Cirrus and work with people literally around the world. And if you have a question you'd like to have answered on the show, please go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Listener Questions, which you'll find up at the top of the webpage, and then you can record your question or send me an email and I'll play it here on the show. And if you want to send an email instead, just go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contacts at the top of the page, and I'd love to hear from you about just about anything. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.